Welcome to Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone today. We have Patrick from Liberty Weekly. Follow Patrick on Twitter at Liberty Weekly. You can find him on Patreon at patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. I have the links to his YouTube channel below in the comments. His DMs are open on Twitter, so anything you disagree with, you can definitely take him up on. Patrick, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good, man. How's it going, Keith?
It's going excellent. I was at the Norm Macdonald comedy special in Arizona, and my dad and I got there 2 hours early, and we ended up just talking politics. And I realized that after about 3 or 4 years of being a libertarian voluntarist, I had made literally no progress with my dad, who was a liberal, progressive, socialist. So I wanted to have you on. By the way, if you haven't seen Patrick's video on libertarian books you need to read, watch that once you've watched all of my material, obviously. But you gotta watch you gotta watch that video. It's great. I saw he has so much knowledge on this topic that I want to bring up some of the main objections progressives and conservatives have with the libertarian ideology. Patrick, are you ready for the devil's advocate game?
Well, now you talk me up so much, I'm a little nervous, but all right.
I felt that all of it was fair. All right, so
I appreciate it.
All right, so Patrick, libertarianism talks a lot about economics and wealth and stuff. Why don't libertarians care about the poor?
Well, I mean, so this is a question that people will ask a whole bunch of times, but I guess the token answer that you'd hear from people like Dave Smith is just saying that, the track record that we see across human history is that the freer the markets, the more prosperous the people are. And moreover, I mean, the United States has a long, storied history of philanthropy, but moreover, we see that if you can increase material well-being through free markets, people are more prosperous, commodities are cheaper, and services cost less. And moreover, it's about making a bigger slice of the pie, I guess you could say. I don't like that analogy per se, but that's what you'll hear a lot of times. If you increase the material well-being of everyone, then the poor are much better off.
Well, that simply is not what happens. What happens is you get big companies who end up monopolizing industries. They hoard all the wealth and basically use property rights as a way to stop people from moving up the economic ladder and competing with them. That is why we need government regulation. It's why we need a sort of a redistributionist state in order to stop the rich from taking over. Government is like this tool we use just to fix the leak that is the market.
Yeah, it must pain you to make these arguments, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
Anyways, so yeah, throughout history, American history, and this is anecdotal evidence, but you'll see that usually it's corporations that will get behind the wheel of government, and what they will do is they will use their regulatory power to increase the barrier to entry so that smaller businesses rather have a harder time to get in. And then so the larger businesses, since they are larger, they have a bigger pool of wealth and more establishment in the marketplace. It's a lot easier for them to lower their prices and make it so that the other businesses can't compete. You see this with the airline industry specifically, is one that Rothbard talks about, is that back in the day, you could take a really cheap budget flight and there would be problems inside the airplane, but you would get safely from point A to point B. You'd have to deal without, all the material well-being of something that a larger airline could provide. But then the airline industry was lobbied, and the government got more involved and made regulations. And so you used to have smaller firms that would actually do more local flights, but it was cartelized, which is what you see in pretty much every major industry in the United States. And then we have, businesses that can't compete, and so they manifest into monopolies. And and libertarians would quibble with condemn Wall Street and big business too, in the sense that they get in bed with the government and actually end up controlling things from behind the scenes. So,
well, okay, yes, of course, democracy isn't perfect, but uh, that that's the point. The government is a way for the poor in society to sort of get their voice heard. So what we need to do is vote out the crooks who are in bed with the big corporations. And yeah, right now the state is very corrupt, but that's why we need to work with it, vote in the right people, and use the right mechanisms in order to correct what the greedy capitalists have turned our government into.
yeah, so the vote harder argument. Well, first of all, a lot of people have said that the United States is a democracy, and I know we're playing devil's advocate, but I really hate it when people say that, because if you understand history, you know that the whole point of our Republican governmental system is to have a check against mob rule and the tyranny of the majority, as John Locke talked about, and John Stuart Mill. Actually, I think Mill more specifically. But so when you're talking about, Benjamin Franklin said, well, what kind of government do we have? A republic, if you can keep it. And so the founding fathers understood that power corrupts, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so you get into it with you give a certain legislative body the power to do whatever they want. It doesn't matter who you vote into office, because the mechanism, giving them, to make the Lord of the Rings analogy that I always make, is that giving someone the ring of power always corrupts them. It is, in fact, I think Tolkien himself actually meant the ring of power to be an allegory for political power that we give these authorities, and that it always goes to their heart and it always corrupts them. And we see that time and time and time and time again throughout history, but we never learn from it. And I understand that's anecdotal evidence, but I'm not writing a research paper.
Well, this just proves the point more that Bernie Sanders always likes to make. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We need to get involved, and we need to make sure the greedy people are kept out and they're representing the voice of the majority.
Yeah, I understand. So, but when it comes to, if under democracy being mob rule, it's what is the analogy is that two wolves and one sheep sit down to vote about what's for dinner. And I think that is so true. You can justify anything through democratic consensus. And you see that the Holocaust was, Hitler was democratically elected. I know that's anecdotal too, and I'll always call that out. But the masses of people are not a good indication, or popular consensus is not a good indication of what the correct policy should be. And I would I would rely on Hans Hermann Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Failed, talking about, he made the point to illustrate that a monarchy was actually preferable to democracy, even though I don't think that Hoppe is a monarchist. He is an anarcho-capitalist, but just to say that a government that is privately owned, at least whoever owns the government has the incentive to make sure that that government will last longer than just 20 years. Whereas if you get the mob rule, then you get people voting and designating rights to certain parties that they don't have. And that's the inherent problem with government in general. And we discussed this a little bit before going on, but that's the fundamental failing of the state, is that so, and I'm getting a little off topic here, but I always think of the moon as a harsh mistress. And I think it's ironic because in that book, they ended up going from anarchy to having a government. But in the beginning, the three conspirators are sitting down at the table, and the scholarly professor type says, the fundamental question is it moral for a collective to do that which is immoral for an individual to do? And that's the question I will always ask people. And they always dodge it or say that morality is relative. And I think that's a huge cop-out. But moreover, how how can we assign rights that we don't have ourselves, and do immoral things become moral when a collective performs it instead of an individual?
Okay. So what about history resulting in every single society since ancient Egypt having a government? This is so many societies have brought governments up. People have delegated their rights to the state, and whether it's in forms of protection or simply just to establish law, some sort of system to regulate the bad people in society. Every civilization ever has done that. Why do you think every single society since the Babylonians have been wrong and the anarcho-capitalists are right?
Well, I think that, well, Rothbard would make the argument that usually when the state is an invention of conquering territory, and I think that the early states arrived out of, excuse me, I can't say much to Babylon or Egypt or anything like that, but I think from time immemorial, the state has emerged as people conquering each other and then realizing that it was more profitable or prosperous for the conquering tribes, instead of looting and raping and, you know, destroying everything, is to settle down and enslave the populace and live off of their, you know, to farm them in a certain sense and to live off of their subsistence. Moreover, I think the natural state of man, when you talk about indigenous tribes, is statelessness, actually, because even indigenous tribes, and I did a work on this, and I can't remember if I published it or not, but there are voluntary legal systems or voluntary arrangements of people that exist all over the world right now in the third world, whether it's through tribes or you know, rural groups of people that band together voluntarily, and they enforce a state of law through not through coercion, but through social ostracization and through hierarchies of honor and good standing in the community. And I think there are several instances of statelessness that were rather successful. You can point to 1,000 years in Ireland there was of anarchy, if you wanted to call it that, or medieval Iceland had it wasn't democratic, but it was a anarchic society, as well as the Anglo-Saxons were, although they were warlike, they were a very libertarian-ish society, and they developed the common law from which, you know, the Western legal tradition is derived. And moreover, you could say, you know, out on the West, the wagon trails, there were voluntary associations there, and functioning anarchy, where a lot of the rule and justice and actually essential infrastructure like railroads and trails were created through the free market. So do you have any quibbles to pick apart with that? Because,
you know, I'm just wondering, you are so critical of our society economically, morally, foreign policy, all this stuff. Why don't you and all your libertarian friends go to Somalia? This way you can be in your paradise and you don't have to be taxed or regulated or any of that stuff. Well, seriously, why don't you just do what the Amish do? Start your own colony and stop trying to force your libertarian ideas on us.
yeah, that's an interesting question. So I could pick that apart from several directions. I think the first being that Somalia actually is the result of, well, it would be folly to say that statelessness would be the only necessary precondition for prosperity. And you could pick apart Somalia and say that what is in Somalia is the result of a failed state. But moreover, there are roads in Somalia, and I have pictures of them, and they look a lot nicer than what they look like here in St. Paul. But you know, making the "why don't you move to Somalia" argument is like asking an abused woman why she doesn't leave her husband. You know, I think that it's, you know, they are the ones who suck, so why should I move? You know, I'm the one being aggressed against. And moreover, I guess if it was possible, I would leave. But, you know, there's extenuating circumstances like my family here, whom I care about very much. You know, so I think that, but the asking an abused woman why she doesn't leave her abuser is probably a good objection to that argument, because usually you'll get that from lefties, and I think they've heard that, the Somalia thing, and they've used it as a meme. I don't know if they understand how ridiculous that argument is or not.
Well, no, Patrick. Let's say that America just gives you libertarians Nebraska. You get all of Nebraska. Then will you be happy? Then will you start leaving us alone? Then will you stop tweeting taxation is theft every 5 seconds?
Well, I think it's ironic saying leave us alone, because all we want to do is be left alone. And it's not in the nature of the state to do that, because if you understand the nature of the state, they are definitionally, they have a territorial monopoly on the use of force and violence within a given area. And it's not within the nature of the state just to leave people alone like that.
Well, okay, yes, government doesn't leave us alone, but government is something that we as a society have come together and agreed to in order to have some sense of stability within us living together. This way, every conflict doesn't end in gunfire. Things don't end in glass stabbings. There's no Wild West. There's no tyranny of guy with the most guns. So that is why we establish governments, in order to have some sort of peace.
Well, the good counter to that I've heard of recently, that I'm going to employ maybe for the first time here, is that a government with, or a society without government. So a society with government is the guarantee. Sorry, start over. A society without government is the possibility that people might live in peace, but a society with government is a guarantee that people will be systematically taxed and extorted, and there will be violence used against them. And there's a very interesting case to be made that the only reason that the government is able to promulgate violence and to use force is because they have a deep well of tax cattle for which to socialize the negative effects of doing conflict, because we know as libertarians economically that violence and war represents a pure economic loss. But to the state, it is profitable if they can socialize the losses and privatize the gains. And that's pretty much what has been going on throughout history. That's why, the state, controls us to socialize the losses of their endeavors and to create cartels and stuff like that. But so throughout history, you see, that there's a lot of the incentive behind violence is to get control of the state. And if you're talking about violence, the state democide is, the state is the number one purveyor of violence throughout society. It's responsible for the most deaths. It's responsible for most of human suffering in the world. And if we get rid of that systematic legitimacy given to violence, then there might be the possibility of some people actually living in peace.
Okay, so earlier you spoke ill of democratically elected Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler, we can agree, bad guy, Holocaust, bad thing, Nuremberg laws, bad thing, invading countries, bad thing. And that perfectly illustrates why we need a government. We need government because other governments exist. And without Roosevelt, without Churchill, without Stalin, we could not have defeated Hitler. And that is reason, again, that that we need a state in order to fight big, evil, powerful people like the Hitlers of the world.
Yeah, I actually think that, so when it comes to invading, it's pretty damn hard to invade a people that essentially throughout the world, what a war is two states fighting each other for control over resources, or maybe to destroy one another. But when you have maybe a massive state like that, it's very hard to. So what you're doing when you're conquering is you are trying to get control of the state apparatus of a different state. Moreover, if the entire world was stateless, maybe Hitler could try to invade other people, but it would, at least it would never last, because you would be, it's like herding cats, or trying to go through and invade an army or a people that is decentralized and fighting you every step of the way. It's very difficult to do that.
But what do you think happens December 8th, 1941, September 12th, 2001? How do we respond when people attack us?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, if you want to get conspiratorial, you could talk about how, well, I mean, I'm a 9/11 truther, but I could also talk about, how throughout history, the state has created false flags in order to invoke conflicts. And you could talk about how, throughout history, the banks fund both sides. There's a compelling case that, and I wouldn't die on a hill for this, but there's a compelling case to be made that the Germans were actually funded by U.S. banking interests. And so when you get those, the state interest, and moreover the Federal Reserve, I could talk about for days how the Federal Reserve, central banking, was actually created by the British Empire to fund their wars, which they ran out of money to wage. And so therefore they, cartelized money, and the state got control of money so that they could, well, in states throughout history have sought control of money and to regulate the money supply. But you could talk about how this, how central banking itself was able to finance these massive world wars and massive invading forces. Ron Paul always says that it's no coincidence that the era of central banking coincided with the era of total war. And I think this is anecdotal as well, but I think throughout history, it wasn't until modern times when war started to be waged against people themselves. Because before in history, and I could be wrong about this, but I think before in history, the state wars were always armies fighting other armies, or armies trying to get control of the state. But it's only a modern occurrence, and maybe beginning with the Civil War and Sherman's March to the Sea, and where you see armies waging war on civilian populations. And I think that's despicable, especially, and I think it's all made possible with central banking.
And look, I agree with a lot of that, and that's why we need reforms like the Fed needs to be nationalized. This whole idea of private property, I think we need to have a collectivization of property. This way, the whole war for property thing can stop. This way, that incentive isn't there to start wars for money, to stage false flags, to lie people into wars through babies and incubator tragedies that are completely fabricated by the private sector. So isn't that just another example of why we need to sort of come together, collectivize the property of the people for the people in a government which is voluntarily agreed upon, and then we work that way instead of working in a greed dog-eat-dog society?
Yeah, well, you could ask Stalin how that worked out, how, or Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward, responsible for the most deaths in history. But I think, moreover, I would assert the natural rights theory that you own yourself, and because you own yourself, you mix your labor with property within the world, and you homestead it. And by mixing your labor with it, you mix part of your life, because your labor is your time and your effort. So by homesteading something, it becomes your own. And because you own that, you should be able to legitimately trade with other people who have legitimately homesteaded property. And that's the theory of natural rights. When we institute that in the world, we see the material prosperity of everyone rising, instead of pursuing the policies, the failed socialist policies of the past that have resulted in mass starvation and democide on a terrible, terrifying scale.
Okay, so Bill Gates and Steve Jobs have kids, right? Now, when someone is born in the projects, they do not have the same opportunities, access to resources, access to knowledge, friends of the family, that the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs and the one percenters of the world have. the government is necessary because government is the equalizer, which sort of takes the people up here and can help out the people down here. In this state of nature, we're just constantly like this, and we keep moving farther and farther apart until my hands can't even be seen on the Mac anymore. And the redistribution is what keeps money flowing. It's good for the economy, and it helps people who, say, people of color, whose ancestors were enslaved and who are just still feeling the after effects of Jim Crow, women who weren't able to vote. The state is the mechanism for equality. How does the libertarian respond to that irrefutable fact?
Well, I would start by talking about minimum wage laws, because, and this will really trigger a lot of liberals, and they just can't wrap their head around it. I've had several conversations on Facebook in the last few days about how the minimum wage, I think, is the one of the most destructive forces for people in the inner cities, and I guess what you would say disadvantaged, because the minimum wage law was written by rabid eugenicists who actually knew its effect, and they knew that it would cause unemployment, and it did. It's been very terrible and destructive. Excuse me. Along with the war on drugs, I think would be the second most policy. Just and criminalization just in general, because if you want to get into the minimum wage, we know that supply and demand, being libertarians, is the laws that govern economics in that sense. And so putting a price ceiling, or a price floor rather, causes unemployment, causes shortages on both the labor end and the employment end and the labor end. And so you're manipulating the price discovery process there. Moreover, from a moral standpoint, you're getting in and you're preventing an otherwise mutually agreed upon contract between two people. And I think with the war on drugs is maybe something that I would push more so, because then you'll get a lot of traction with lefty liberals talking about how it's immoral to, well, you know the talking points. It's immoral to prevent someone from doing something that doesn't affect anyone else, and you get these incredibly destructive effects, dangerous alternatives, stuff like that. But one thing what liberals really have no idea what to do with is when you assert the fact that the minimum wage agenda is driven exclusively by eugenicists from the progressive era who knew what it would do. And they did it because, I think I have a great quote from Royal Meeker, who was the labor secretary appointed by Woodrow Wilson. And this is Economics, Eugenics, and the Minimum Wage, libertyweekly.net/14 is my most popular episode with my co-host Jerry. And we dissected this. We went over the economics, and we talk about Royal Meeker in his quote saying that I think the minimum wage was meant to bring more unfortunates and undesirables to the teat of the state, to not subsidize their unthrift, but to prevent them from bringing forth more of their breed. And that was a rough quote, but I think those are the words, specifically, bring forth more of their breed. It's some pretty dark stuff, man. And I think at the heart of all these progressive reforms at the early 20th century is that eugenics agenda. And I don't mean to get conspiratorial, but I think asserting that, because you can come at it from an economics and logics perspective, but one thing I've found is that logic does not work with lefties specifically. And if you assert the eugenics agenda and prove it to them, they have no idea what to do with it.
Okay. I'm really not sure why you think we should legalize drugs. How would legalizing drugs make our society better?
Well, I think we learned our lesson with Prohibition, specifically, because we do have an instance specifically where we outlawed a certain type of drug, one that's arguably more destructive than marijuana, say, or I think others. But drugs used to be not involved with the pharmaceutical industry. I think that the war on drugs is primarily represents the cartelization of the pharmaceutical industry. I wrote a paper about this that my subscribers will get, my Patreon subs will get. It's up there. I think my email subscribers too. But it documents the war on drugs and how the American pharmaceutical industry was lobbying for it from the very beginning. And because it used to be that you could just buy cocaine off the shelf, you could just walk in without a prescription and, you know, buy what you want. But a lot of this has to do with the Civil War, and you had alcohol prohibition coming into play. And I wanted to talk about that too, because, and I know I'm kind of scattered here, but if you get into the reasons behind alcohol prohibition and why it was enacted, is because around the time that prohibition, and it was a long time coming, but around the time, people were really actually finding out that alcohol itself was a viable alternative for fueling cars. And I think the Rockefellers and the big oil got behind. You can see this in James Corbett's documentary, How Big Oil Conquered the World. The unknown history of the Prohibition movement was how the Rockefellers got behind and funded a lot of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and those movements to make alcohol legal so it couldn't compete with oil and gasoline. But more when you get into cocaine and stuff like that, a lot of the laws behind the impetus and when they argued for these laws in the beginning was pretty racist and pretty discriminatory against blacks. And in each prospective community, it targeted people who were known to use the drugs, maybe. But what it does is it creates dangerous alternatives, and it creates criminal cartels, because the cartels cannot rely on the state's protection. So therefore, they become criminal just because you say that they are criminal. And because they are criminal, they cannot be sued. Well, they cannot rely on the state's protection, and they cannot be sued. So there you have a few quality controls right there. And if we could sue criminals or cartels that produce the drugs, you would have some quality control. You would let the free market do its work instead of the black market, because black markets aren't necessarily free markets. They're a reaction to the state making things illegal. But you could have those quality controls. Moreover, market forces would lead to a standard doses like you get with, say, soda or something like that. There's a reason why soda across the board comes in a certain serving size. And there was one other point that I wanted to bring up, but it's not coming to me right now.
Okay, so why do I want to live in a society where my kids can constantly have access to cocaine and meth and crack?
Well, I mean, you could take some personal responsibility for your children and make sure as a conservative argument, you could make sure that, you know, they're not getting in trouble in that way. But you know, they already do in our society have access to that if they really know where they want to get it from.
Exactly. It's easy now. I don't want to make it any easier.
Well, I mean, back in the day, you had kids that could just walk in, and I think there'd be a moral issue with a shopkeeper who was, you know, peddling drugs to children, and people could boycott the store. But I don't think that, you know, methamphetamines and cocaine was that big of an issue in children way back in the day. And I think what you have now is you have children being born in the inner city where they're subjected to a gang lifestyle where they're in plenty of contact with this. And I think drug dealers will give the children's drugs so that the children will work for them and stuff. And then, you know, they'll get arrested for a minor drug charge, and then they'll go to prison where they'll learn how to be a better criminal, and then they'll just come back out on the street. I think drug use is a societal issue. I think that is driven more so, and this is anecdotal, I don't have much to back this up, but I think it's driven more so by economic circumstances. I do know that domestic violence is intimately tied with joblessness and unemployment, but I would assume it would be the same. You have broken families, you have dire economic circumstances, and you have, you know, drugs are the only thing that people can turn to try and get through the drudgery of it. And when it's available, why not? If you have no prospects for anything.
Well, yeah, we have broken families. We have poor people who are in dire economic circumstances. That's why we need the government to create a safety net for those people. And we need the government constantly helping out with jobs. That's why we need government to supply education, so we're not a country of idiots who can't work. Those are all reasons we need the state to be involved in moving our society forward.
Well, I could start with the moral argument about taxation being theft and about stealing from one to give to another, but I think it was Thomas Sowell specifically said that when you subsidize something, you get more of it. And Peter Schiff has said that labor itself is something that people desire, or leisure, excuse me. And I shouldn't be drinking this. I'm drinking the seltzer, or it's so carbonated, but. Yeah, so Peter Schiff he's talked about how leisure itself is something that people desire. So if you subsidize leisure, that's something that people will, expect more of. And I think the economy grows through capital investment, and it grows through giving people opportunities. And if you want to make a Christian argument, you would say, why give people fish? Or you could teach a man to fish and he'll feed himself for a lifetime. But if you give a man fish, he'll eat it. I know that doesn't convince liberals or anything, but yeah, this is one thing. It's an emotional argument. It's hard to argue logically from this perspective. So you could talk about economics all day long, but I think what I would do is just assert the fact that what we want is for these people's material well-being to be improved and for them to be able to support themselves. And what we need to do in order to do that is A, get rid of the minimum wage, and B, lower the barrier to entry for small businesses. And that's things like Uber, Lyft. Those companies are becoming more and more statist and corrupt. But if we lowered the barrier to entry for people to start their own small businesses and get rid of predatory lending practices and stuff like that, and make sure that, well, switch to the gold standard. I mean, get rid of the Fed, all that stuff. But just making it easier for people in the inner city not to live off of the government, because that's what the eugenicists wanted. What we want is for them to be able to provide for themselves and to have the social mobility of what the American dream, if that ever existed. Well, it did maybe at one point, but now it doesn't, I don't think. Yeah, so just to provide them with opportunities.
Okay, so I just want to be clear on one thing, and correct me if I heard you wrong. Did you say that taxation is theft?
Yes. Well, okay,
yeah. Hold on. Taxation that every society in all of history has had, that pays for our police and fire department and military, which keeps us safe, that to you is theft, really?
Well, it's more like extortion, but theft is catchier. So
how is us pooling our money together to keep us safe, for there to be roads, how is that theft?
Well, you could provide it. So the fact that it's extorted. So if I don't pay my taxes, there's someone that will eventually, the state will not stop bugging me until I either submit or they're going to put me in a cage. And I think there's no denying that fact. Now with the income tax, they have kind of made it so that you don't even, you still miss it, but you don't even get a chance to get your money before the state has already taken it. And I think when it comes to things like property tax, if you don't pay your property taxes, they will seize your property, they will seize your house, they will foreclose on it, or, well, the bank forecloses, but there's other ways for them to do that. But there are also voluntary ways through the free market to provide these essential services. Everything that the government provides now has at one point been provided on the free market, and it's been provided more efficiently and more effectively that way, including schooling. Traditionally in this country, schooling, a lot of the roads, and actually the Great Northern Railroad was, I have to mention, because the Hill House is right down the street from where I live, the mansion. And it was provided, it was the only railroad that was funded completely privately, and it was the only one that was solvent and didn't need bailouts or anything like that. So the James J. Hill House right down the street. But the taxation is theft. There's no way intellectually to get around that, I don't think.
There is, and you should go to jail if you do not pay taxes, for the same reason you should go to jail if you don't pay back a loan. You're benefiting from our schools. You're benefiting from our military, from our police, from our roads that we fund. And if you don't want to chip in, again, I will help you get a flight to Somalia because I know that that's the paradise you want to live in. Yes, it is not theft because you get something in return for it. It's not like they're just taking it and running away and you're never seeing it again.
Well, if I mow your lawn and then point a gun at you if you don't pay, you receive a benefit from that. Or what? So the most effective way to do this, actually, and we did this is a Larkin Rose tactic, is to do what Daniel and I from the Actual Anarchy podcast call candlesing, because he taught it at his Candles in the Dark conference, is to get down close and personal, to illustrate with someone why the state is evil and why they should oppose it and why taxation is theft, is to get on an individual level with them and to say, okay, you and I are neighbors and we have some other neighbors. There's a town hall meeting and you're not there, or you voted, moreover, against it. You did not want to install streetlights. And what we did is we overpowered you in a vote, and we want to install streetlights. So what we're going to do is show up on your doorstep because you refuse and you do not like streetlights. And we point a gun in your face and we collect the $20 from you that it takes to help install the streetlights. That is still theft. There's nothing that can change that. And moreover, there's no connection between the individual and society, because you're using a lot of collectivized language saying we as a society. You can't point towards society. No one can identify what society is. And Rothbard will talk about this. And I just read For New Liberty, so I'm like ultra supercharged in my radicalism. But so you can't point towards society. Society is amorphous, and it's very, very convenient because, people will argue from the point of society all the time. But when it comes down to it, you can't identify society. And when you are extorting someone or extorting taxes from them, you can point towards the individual and say that is Johnny. He is being extorted here in this situation. He is being put in a cage, or he is being assassinated at gunpoint because he refuses to comply. And I think that's immoral. Even if it was for a library that will teach children, it's still non-consensual. Liberals they'll talk all the time about consent and how much they care about consent. Well, there's a great meme going around about, what makes sex not rape? Consent. What makes, I don't know, a contract not, whatever. Consent. Well, the only thing that makes taxation not theft is magical fairy dust, or so liberals care about consent. Why don't they care about consent when it comes to taxation?
Okay, so why don't you candles me? I want to do this walkthrough,
okay,
so I can explain to you what an unappreciative little brat you Koch brothers funded libertarians are.
Yeah. So I guess it would come, I haven't really employed candles too much, but so say that, I would use the example that I just talked about. So say that we live in a cul-de-sac and there's 6 people on the cul-de-sac.
Okay. Cul-de-sac, 6 people. I'm one of the 6 people?
Yeah. So
perfect.
Say that all 6 of us, 5 of us, including you, voted to install streetlights, and I'm the only person that does not agree. Would you personally come to my house with the gun to collect that money that would go towards the streetlights?
Of course I wouldn't. Why would I? I'm not government. There's government, and then there are non-government actors. I've never said that I can do this, but society delegates jobs to people to produce food, like say a grocery store. In this case, for roads or traffic lights, that's the job we delegate towards government. So yes, government can do it. I can't. I'm not government.
So what if those 5 people that wanted the street lights hired a security guard or a goon with well, maybe not even a goon, maybe they hired a police officer to come and do it for them. Would you be for that? Would you advocate for that, for a third party, someone who doesn't even live on the block, to come over and hold me at gunpoint to collect?
That depends. Is it a government employee or is it just some random schmuck I don't know from a hole in the wall?
Oh, that's a good point. Well, it is a random schmuck. But or hold on, wait, if the 5 of you agree that one of you will be the designated one to come around and to collect from people who don't want the streetlights, would you advocate for that? Even if you got him like a shiny shirt and a copper badge? Well, I mean, what if you all agree?
Yes. Look, yes, I would. And here's why.
Okay.
Because the 5th guy, if he wants to live in any sort of civilized sort of organization, that is what we do in our society. If he doesn't like it, hey, vote. Hey, show up to the meetings, the town hall events. Again, like I said, the heroic Bernie Sanders says democracy is not a spectator sport. That's people getting involved and delegating rights to government.
So if this, out of the 6 of us, if this one person that you've selected to collect comes over, and if I do not comply, what do you advocate that he will do so I would comply? To what extent would you say it's okay for him to do things to me to make me pay?
Well, this is why it's important to listen to law enforcement so bad things don't happen. See, I'm actually here to help you. I don't want bad things to happen, but you just don't want to be part of society. If you don't want the bad things to happen, join us. Be part of society, pay your taxes, be law-abiding, show up to the town halls, vote every 2, 4, and 6 years, and the bad things don't have to happen. I want to stop the bad things from happening. That's why I support government. So to answer your question, I don't believe anything should happen to you so long as you're law-abiding.
So you guys have all agreed that I should pay for streetlights, and if I don't, and if I absolutely refuse to leave or to comply or to move somewhere else, would you advocate that person shooting me, or if I resisted, to put me in a cage or to lock me away or do something like that? Does the orderliness of your society, does it justify that action?
It does. It definitely does, because if no one did it, then it wouldn't get done.
Okay, and at this point, my job is done. From the candle's perspective, because what Larkin Rose says is that you need to realize that you will not convert someone the moment that you are talking to them. And what you need to avoid doing is getting into a prediction fest where one of you is going to say, oh, that wouldn't happen, or XYZ. All you need to do is get to the point where the person you're arguing against acknowledges the fact that they are advocating violence, or they see the reality of the situation, and then it's over. Then your job is done. Don't press it anymore. Change the subject. And hopefully in a week or 2 or a few days, that person will remember the conversation that you had, and they will think it over in their head when they're going to sleep at night or something like that. And they will realize, hey, I'm a sociopath. Or they will realize that what they're advocating for is immoral.
And that concludes our mock debate. Oh my God, was that exhausting. I have so much written down that I want to get to. By the way, if you watched, for those of you who watched my interview with Mance Raider, we talked about his book, Freedom Through Memedom, the 31-Day Guide to Waking Up to Liberty. I mentioned That book and attending the Candles in the Dark seminar were two of the great eye-opening things that I've been through in the last year. The seminar was so good. He gives you a little pamphlet to follow along, notes to take home, and he really does that walkthrough, and it's so good. One of my friends, we brought him in, and Larkin paid him $50 for 15 minutes just to answer the questions, and it was so great. It was so good to watch statists go through that questioning. And the one guy, instead of 15 minutes, ended up staying for like an hour and just talked to everyone. And that guy sent Larkin an email. I think it was the next day or something. Larkin made a Facebook post about it and said, "I think I might be an anarcho-capitalist. Where do I get more information on that?" It was so refreshing to see, because the guy was a diehard constitutionalist, whatever that means. See Lysander Spooner for whatever the hell that means.
I did an episode on that, just saying. I think it's /28 or 29. Yeah. I didn't know that you had gone to the Candles event. That's awesome, because I organically mentioned it on my own. But yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was seriously so worth it. And I was broke at the time. I didn't have a job. Okay, I need to go on this rant of every single thing I mentioned that was a lie and a logical fallacy. Okay, here's what I would here's how I would summarize Patrick's points and what I just loved about him. He talked about the moon is a harsh mistress.
That's hard to say.
I know, especially when you're so worked up from,
yeah, right.
from saying Bernie Sanders. It said something good. Okay, so we mentioned that collectives have no different rights than individuals. And that's something Larkin Rose talks about all the time. If I can't do it, I can't vote for someone to do it for me. If I don't have the right to tax your income, I can't vote for John McCain to tax your income. Another thing you mentioned was wealth over time. When I tried to play the "what about the poor" card, he mentioned collectivization for people like Mao and Stalin. And those are historical examples. We have examples of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Someone 10 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn, in England, was parading as, "Oh, finally, someone's finally getting the message." And within 10 years, they're eating rabbits and breaking into zoos. And meanwhile, the poor people in America, as fat and happy as ever. Patrick mentioned that people often use the word democracy as though it in and of itself is an argument. First of all, democracy is not even, it's simply just mob rule, or lynch mob, or gang rape, or two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Democracy does not equal freedom. When I told him to move to Somalia, to leave us alone, he goes, "Well, that's all libertarians are asking for, just to do things voluntarily, just to leave us alone." And it is ironic when the statist says, you leave us alone. My grandma the other day, huge commie, says, I got a text the other day from a woman just trying to push Mormonism on me. And literally, I'm like, "So she sent you one text and you didn't text back? Has she sent anyone with tanks to your house?" So that is the perfect example of a voluntary attempt to persuade someone. They get pissed off at the one engaging in voluntarism, but their coercion is totally justified because they just love saying the pledge so much. He mentioned 9/11 Truth. There are two books I would recommend regarding 9/11 Truth. One is called Synthetic Terror by Webster Tarpley. He talks about the greatest coincidence in history of the U.S. war games going on by NORAD at the very time the planes are getting hijacked. The reason there was not an immediate response from our $1 trillion a year military was because they thought that those were fake hijackings that were happening at the same exact time. The second book I'd recommend for 9/11 Truth is Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World by Christopher Bolin. Another thing Patrick mentioned was U.S. banking and the connection with Germany. In October of 1942, Prescott Bush from Union Banking had all of his assets seized. Yes, George Bush's grandfather, George H.W. Bush's father, had all his assets seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, but the seizure happened in 1942. You can read more about this book in Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony Sutton. He mentioned the connection between eugenicists and the promoting of the minimum wage, and how Milton Friedman called the minimum wage the most anti-Negro law on the books. I said, don't you fear monopolies? He said, in our attempt to often regulate monopolies, we create barriers to entry for smaller businesses, and that's what creates more poor people. He mentioned the Rockefellers. Great book on the Rockefellers is a book by David Horowitz called The Rockefellers in American Dynasty. That was written some time ago. He uses excellent sources. The drug war, people own their bodies, period. The alcohol prohibition is a great experiment in how cartels are created. Another thing is the U.S. government also poisoned alcohol intentionally during Prohibition. He talked about everything I said that the state created, he said has also been created voluntarily. Of course, when something's voluntarily funded, there's much more of a greater incentive to produce a good product, to lower your price, to use more efficient means to achieve your ends. He asked me if he mowed my lawn without asking me, does he have the right to forcefully take something? Just because I receive a benefit from something or someone receives a benefit does not mean you get to coerce them in any other way. He talked about liberal and there's such false cry of consent. We care about people getting permission before anything happens. If you don't do exactly what those executive orders and all those laws the congressmen write down and vote on, and the zombie laws written down hundreds of years ago, they'll put you in a cage and shoot you if you resist. What happened to Eric Garner is going to happen to all of us if they think we're resisting. That's not a joke. That's not a racism thing. That is a, by definition, what they promise, what they take an oath they will do to us if we don't obey their commandments. Statism is a horrible religion, and I hope today's discussion with Patrick can help people become an atheist to this evil religion of statism. Patrick, one book all Americans can read. I'm sorry, I should stop saying all. One book everyone in the world could read, Patrick. What book would you recommend?
I mean, I would pick Anatomy of the State. It's really cheap. I think it's for free on the Mises website. It's probably the one book that really, I got chills when I read it, like for the first time. And I mean, it's kind of pure ideology, but even talking to people who I've had conversations with, even today on Twitter and stuff, is they don't realize what the fundamental nature of the state is. And once you read it, it just makes absolute sense. I think I would recommend it for people that are more of a conservative mindset, but it really is indispensable. It's great.
The one book, that is the exact book Mance Rader recommended when him and I had a conversation. Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. It's a short essay. It does such a great job of red-pilling the statism out of you. Patrick, give me your 30-second elevator pitch for libertarianism. It is so goddamn hard to hold people's attention nowadays, especially when you're competing with the mainstream media and the politicians and the C-SPAN. Give me your 30-second elevator pitch on why libertarianism is superior to conservatism, progressivism, socialism, and fascism.
Well, Ron Paul says that libertarians are better conservatives than conservatives and better liberals than liberals. And I would talk about the non-aggression principle and say that the non-aggression principle is a fundamental axiom that we all hold and we all know in our individual lives and as children. One of the first things that you learn is don't hit people and don't take their stuff. And I think that this fundamental moral principle is embodied in a lot of the world's major religions. It's the fundamental golden rule. You know, you don't hit people and you don't take their stuff. And you can't The collectives don't have rights that individuals don't have, and therefore the non-aggression principle applies to everyone. And I think if we followed it, it would cause more prosperity and for everyone. And I think we'd be a more moral society.
Another great point that you made, Patrick, was when I had said, well, the state is the one thing keeping us from chaos. It is unbelievable that the history of government has not even put this in the heads of anyone. The history of democide, for this, you can read the University of Hawaii did a paper on this by a guy named R.J. Rummel, talks about democide, death by government, and he doesn't even get into wars, really. He talks about governments killing their own people, whether it's through starvation or through the economic sanctions, or simply just through warfare. Governments, the #1 cause of death, people fear that things would go bad without. I mean, it's literally a woman saying, if I'm not married to O.J. Simpson, things might get dangerous for me. It is so ridiculous that it's really mind control is what's happening when people say we need the group that causes the most violence to monopolize the guns, to control our health care, and tell us how to live. And I'm so thankful he brought that up. Again, follow Patrick at Liberty Weekly on Twitter. Throw the guy a few bucks on Patreon. He's at patreon.com/libertyweekly. If you're not spending the time to make the videos, throw some dough at the people who are taking the time to spread the great word. Again, I have the link to his YouTube channel below here. Patrick, any final words for the viewers tonight?
Yeah, we were talking about war. War is mass murder. I wanted to spread some awareness about Yemen without virtue signaling, but just saying that we are complicit in genocide right now, aiding the Saudi government in fighting the Houthis. No, Hezbollah. It's either the Houthis or the Hezbollah in Yemen, and our sanctions are causing mass starvation there, and for little babies to be inflicted with cholera, which is completely preventable, to piss and shit themselves to death. Sorry for my language, but I think it's an atrocity going on right now that people don't know about, and I just wanted to say something about it. But I really appreciate being on your show with you, Keith. I really like what I do. I've been really supercharged towards it lately, and I think that we can spread the word of liberty through profitable independent media, and because we know the nature of capitalism. So I think we need to employ renegade capitalism with renegade media, and that's what I'm trying to do. And so I'd encourage anyone to participate in this process, because that is how great, it's so easy to get on with someone and to have these conversations. So thanks so much. You can check me out at libertyweekly.net.
I'm sorry, I can't end there. What you said is so important.
Yeah.
So here is May 1996. Madeleine Albright, who was then U.S. ambassador to the UN, was asked by Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes in reference to the years of U.S.-led economic sanctions against Iraq. Leslie Stahl says, "We've heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?" Madeleine Albright, U.S. ambassador to the UN, responds, "I think that is a very hard choice, but the price, we think, is worth it." We are not just up against the technicalities of rights violations. We're up against crazy, psychopathic murderers. And
Yep.
If that doesn't tell you right there, why did Bill Clinton not give her the death penalty and say she does not represent us? Absolutely not. But they're so worried about Russia maybe having an interference in the election, or George Bush pronounced nuclear wrong. These people, as a causal result of their actions, 500,000 children died. Granted, those estimates might not be accurate, but even if it wasn't, she said, assume that is the number, that's worth it.
Even if one child died, in our opinion, too much, but yeah. Or we saw he died. Ha 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 ha.
We saw he died. And she's talking about the leader or a dictator leader of a political system, and she's so worried about Russians interfering in the U.S. political system. Bullshit! If you still believe in government when they lie to your face like this, when a woman gets on CBS, mainstream media, and says, yeah, killing 500,000 kids is perfectly fine with us. We're not going to have any investigations. We're not going to put anyone else on trial. Don't even expect a sorry from us, because we're not sorry. This is what we're up against. And that's why I take the time to make this video. That's why I asked Patrick to take his time, because it is this serious. I promise this will be the final word that I give Patrick McFarland right here at Liberty Weekly. Patrick, what do you have?
Well, I've had a great time. That's about it. I got nothing else, because if I say anything else, we'll go on for another 2 hours. And I'd enjoy it, but my wife might be a little mad.
Again, follow Patrick McFarland at Liberty Weekly. Thank you guys so much for watching Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone. Take care. And for God's sake, spread the non-aggression principle to everyone you know.